Look at it. The Twilight Zone it's a place of imagination, a land of shadow. To reach it, you write a dream. To enter it, you need only your imagination.
A network doesn't erase its own work unless something went horribly wrong. CBS didn't just skip a rerun of this one. For 52 years they refused to let it air again anywhere in the United States. Not because it was boring. Not because the ratings were bad. Because the episode you're about to hear about accidentally repeated one of the ugliest lies in American history, and once people noticed, there was no putting it back on the shelf. This is the story of The Encounter, the only original episode of The Twilight Zone pulled from American syndication and kept out of circulation for over 5 decades. Before we get into the episode itself, it helps to understand what Rod Serling was trying to do with this show in the first place. Serling served in the Pacific during World War II, jumping with a U.S. Army airborne unit into brutal fighting in the Philippines. He came home carrying the weight of what he'd seen, and by his own account, that experience shaped the rest of his writing career. He didn't start out writing about aliens or haunted houses. In the years before The Twilight Zone, Serling was one of live television's most respected dramatists, writing hard-hitting scripts like Patterns, about corporate ruthlessness, and Requiem for a Heavyweight, about a washed-up boxer being discarded by the people who used him. Both won him major awards. But when he tried to write directly about real, contemporary social issues, he kept running into the same wall. Network sponsors who didn't want their commercials sitting next to anything that might upset a customer. One of the clearest examples of that fight came in 1958, when Serling wrote a live teleplay for Playhouse 90 called A Town Has Turned to Dust, loosely inspired by the murder of Emmett Till, a black teenager who was tortured and killed in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of offending a white woman. Serling wanted to tell that story honestly. The sponsors, worried about alienating viewers and advertisers in the South, wouldn't allow it. By the time the network was finished with the script, the setting had been moved to the Old West, the racial dynamics had been softened almost beyond recognition, and Serling was left comparing the final product to a steer that had been taken apart by a room full of butchers. He wasn't the only writer clashing with sponsors that way either. That same Playhouse 90 era produced other infamous fights over content, including a widely reported incident where a gas company sponsor on a different broadcast objected to on-air references to Nazi gas chambers and had the audio cut mid-sentence rather than let the words go out over the air. That was the environment Serling was working in. Writers with something real to say and sponsors with veto power over whether they could say it. That experience is generally understood to be a major reason Serling pivoted towards science fiction and fantasy. He later said, in essence, that a Martian could get away with saying things on screen that would get an American character in serious trouble with the sponsors. If a story was set on another planet or involved a ghost or a cursed object, the censors tended to relax, because on the surface it just looked like a spooky story for a Tuesday night. Underneath, though, Serling kept smuggling in the same arguments about war, conformity, fear, and prejudice that he'd been blocked from making directly. That's the whole engine behind The Twilight Zone, and it's a big part of why the show is remembered as more than just a genre exercise more than 60 years later. It's also worth remembering that this wasn't some small low-stakes show. The Twilight Zone ran for 5 seasons and 156 episodes, won Emmy Awards, and turned Serling into one of the most recognizable faces on American television, thanks to his clipped, deadpan introductions at the start and end of every episode. He had, by any measure, won his long argument with the network. He'd proven a genre show could be smarter and more honest than the respectable dramas that had rejected his earlier work. That strategy worked again and again for 5 seasons. But strategies built on disguise can also misfire, and in the final season, one script aimed at exactly the kind of subject Serling usually handled with care instead landed as a direct hit on the very community it was supposedly defending. The episode is called The Encounter. It aired on May 1, 1964 as the 151st episode of the series, written by Martin M. Goldsmith and directed by Robert Butler, not written by Serling himself, though it aired under his name as the show's creator and on-screen host. Unlike a lot of Twilight Zone episodes, there's no spaceship, no alien, no small town hiding a secret. It's just 2 men, 1 room, and a door that won't open. Neville Brand plays Fenton, a World War II veteran who spent the years since the war drinking alone, surrounded by old souvenirs in a cluttered attic. Brand wasn't just playing a soldier. In real life he was one of the most highly decorated American servicemen of the war, having earned a Silver Star for his actions in combat in Europe. That background reportedly gave his performance an intensity that unsettled people on set, blurring the line between the actor and the increasingly unstable character he was playing. Into Fenton's attic walks a young Japanese-American man named Arthur Takamori, played by George Takei, 2 years before he became known to the world as Sulu on Star Trek. Arthur is looking for yard work sent over by a neighbor. Fenton, gruff but cordial at first, invites him up for a beer. What follows is a slow unraveling. Fenton finds an old samurai sword tucked away among his war trophies and tells Arthur he took it off a Japanese soldier he killed in combat, though the details of that story shift as he keeps talking. The sword carries an inscription in Japanese, something to the effect that it will avenge its owner, and as the conversation continues, it seems to keep finding its way back into Fenton's hands no matter how many times he tries to put it down. As the heat in the attic rises, so does the hostility. Fenton starts directing raw, ugly resentment at Arthur, blaming him personally for a war he had no part in fighting. Arthur, for his part, reveals that he changed his name from Taro, and the two men circle each other verbally until the tension boils over into a physical struggle. The episode ends badly for both of them. Fenton is killed on the blade and Arthur, seemingly overtaken by the same dark force that's been driving the sword all episode, leaps out the attic window with a battle cry. On its own, that's a grim, small-scale tragedy about how hatred consumes people on both sides of it. A theme the Twilight Zone had explored elsewhere without much controversy at all. The problem was one specific piece of dialogue. During the argument, Arthur admits that his father used a mirror to signal Japanese warplanes during the attack on Pearl Harbor. In other words, that his own father was a spy who helped the enemy. It's presented in the episode as Arthur's private shame, the thing eating away at him just as Fenton's guilt over his own wartime killing is eating away at Fenton. Here's the problem. There has never been credible evidence that any Japanese American signaled Japanese aircraft during the Pearl Harbor attack. That specific accusation, a Japanese American civilian secretly aiding the enemy on American soil, was one of the exact unfounded rumors used to justify the mass incarceration of well over 100,000 Japanese American men, women, and children during the war, the overwhelming majority of them American citizens who had done nothing wrong. By putting that unfounded claim directly into the mouth of its only Japanese-American character, the encounter wasn't just telling a fictional story about prejudice, it was repeating, almost word for word, the exact propaganda that had been used to strip an entire community of their homes, their businesses, and their freedom less than 25 years earlier. For anyone who had actually lived through the camps, this wasn't a spooky plot twist. It was watching primetime television treat the accusation that ruined their family as something plausible, dressed up as a supernatural morality tale. The backlash came fast. The Japanese American Citizens League and other members of the Japanese American community objected strongly to how the episode handled the subject, and CBS found itself facing real criticism over a show that had spent years positioning itself as one of television's more thoughtful voices on prejudice and injustice. The timing made it worse. The episode aired in 1964, just as the United States was deepening its involvement in Vietnam, another war against another Asian country, which only sharpened how loaded the episode's themes felt to viewers at the time. CBS's response wasn't to apologize publicly or explain what had gone wrong. It was quieter than that. The encounter simply stopped being shown. It wasn't included when the rest of the series went into syndication for reruns on local stations across the country, and while practically every other Twilight Zone episode played on a loop for generations of fans discovering the show for the first time, this one just vanished from American broadcast television. It's worth noting that the episode did air abroad without the same fallout. It reportedly ran in Canada without incident, which tells you the backlash was specifically tied to how directly the story touched an unhealed American wound. It's worth sitting with just how recent that history was for the people watching in 1964. Executive Order 9066, signed in February 1942, gave the government the authority to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast and hold them in camps for the duration of the war. Families lost homes, farms, and businesses almost overnight, often selling everything they owned for a fraction of its value before being sent to hastily built camps in remote parts of the country. The last of those camps didn't close until 1946. So when The Encounter aired less than 20 years later, the people who had lived through that experience weren't watching ancient history dramatized on their television, they were watching a show revive the exact justification that had been used against them, within the lifetime of people who still remembered walking out of their own front doors for the last time. For George Takei, the role carried a weight that almost nobody else on set could have fully understood at the time. As a young child, Takei and his family were among the people forced into internment camps during the war, held behind barbed wire for years simply because of their ancestry. Decades later, he would speak and write extensively about that experience, including through the musical Allegiance. which he helped bring to the stage specifically to tell the true story of the camps to a wider audience. But in 1964 he was a young actor with very few options. Serious dramatic roles for Asian American performers were scarce, and turning down a lead part in one of television's most respected anthology series wasn't a realistic choice for someone trying to build a career. He took the role, worked opposite a genuine war hero in Neville Brand, and delivered a performance that still holds up as one of the more striking guest turns in the show's history, even though the episode built around it stayed buried for most of his career, and he reportedly said very little about it publicly for decades afterward. The show itself was already in rough shape by the time The Encounter aired. CBS had forced the series into an hour-long format for its fourth season, which threw off the punchy, twist-driven pacing that had made the half-hour episodes work so well. The network reversed that decision for the fifth and final season, but the damage to the show's momentum had already been done. Newer anthology competitors were starting to crowd the space Sorling had built almost single-handedly a few years earlier, and Sorling himself, worn down by years of fighting the network over nearly every script, was leaning more heavily on other writers rather than personally shaping every episode the way he had in the early seasons. The Twilight Zone wasn't cancelled with any kind of dramatic send-off. CBS simply didn't renew it, and after 5 seasons and 156 episodes, one of the most influential shows in television history quietly went off the air in 1964. The Encounters stayed locked away for the next 52 years, resurfacing only occasionally through home video collections for diehard collectors willing to track it down. Then, on January 3, 2016, Sci-Fi aired the episode as part of its annual New Year's Twilight Zone marathon, the first time it had appeared on American broadcast television since its original airing. Reaction online was immediate and split. Some viewers were fascinated to finally see the so-called banned episode they'd only heard rumors about. Others were stunned that a plot point repeating a debunked, damaging wartime myth had ever been written into a network show at all, let alone one built around exposing prejudice. The episode is now available to stream, typically accompanied by context explaining the historical inaccuracy at the center of its original controversy, rather than being presented without comment the way it was in 1964. Watching it now, more than 60 years later, The Encounter occupies an odd, uncomfortable space in the show's legacy. It isn't remembered as one of the strongest episodes on pure craft. Critics at the time and since have generally agreed it lacks the sharp, controlled twist that made the series famous, and the two-hander format leans hard on Brand and Takei to carry a script that doesn't always earn its ending. But it's remembered and still studied precisely because of how it failed. Sorling's whole approach was built on using fiction to expose the prejudice hiding underneath ordinary American life. The Encounter set out to do exactly that and instead ended up reinforcing the very prejudice it was trying to examine, by treating a piece of wartime propaganda as though it might be true. It's a genuinely useful case study in how good intentions in storytelling don't automatically protect you from doing real harm, especially when the story you're telling is built around a community's actual, documented suffering. Rod Serling didn't get to see how any of this played out in the long run. He died on June 28, 1975 at the age of 50, following complications from a series of heart attacks, after a career built almost entirely on trying to use fantasy and allegory to tell people uncomfortable truths about themselves. Whether he would have defended The Encounter, or agreed it deserved to be pulled is something we'll never know for certain. The script wasn't his, after all, even if it carried his name and his show's reputation. What we do know is that the episode's decades-long disappearance and its eventual return sparked a conversation that's still relevant today. When a piece of media gets something this wrong, is the right move to bury it forever, or to keep it available with the context that lets people understand exactly what went wrong and why? That question doesn't have an easy answer, and reasonable people land in different places on it. Some argue that content built around a harmful false accusation shouldn't be given a platform again at all, no matter how much time has passed, because re-airing it risks giving new life to an old myth. Others argue that hiding it just erases the historical record of what mainstream American television was willing to broadcast in 1964, and that showing it today with honest framing actually does more to educate people about the internment camps and the propaganda that justified them than pretending the episode never happened. Both positions come from wanting to prevent harm, they just disagree about which choice does that better. So that's the story behind the only original Twilight Zone episode CBS wouldn't touch again for half a century, not a story about censorship for its own sake, but about a show built on exposing prejudice, accidentally repeating it, and the long, uncomfortable process of figuring out what to do once everyone realized it. It's also a reminder of just how much creative fighting went into making The Twilight Zone, what it was in the first place. A show whose creator spent years going to war with his own network just to be allowed to tell the truth, only to watch one episode, made without him at the typewriter, undo some of that hard-won trust in a single afternoon in an attic. What do you think? Should networks keep episodes like this buried for good, or is putting them back out there with honest context the better call? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the stories behind classic television, subscribe and we'll see you in the next one.